let's take a look at LFA, what they got coming up this week. We got LFA 150 coming up to start. So that's happening on the 13th. I believe that's Friday.
Yes.
So let's start out, look at a couple of the fights here. Obviously, let's talk about the main event a little bit. 135. I'm not too familiar with either of these guys, but both seem to have solid records at 12-3, 11-3, high ranking in Brazil and in the regional scene for Sweeney. Um, are you familiar with either of these guys and have any sort of expectations?
No expectations. I feel like I've heard of both of these fighters very much actually, especially Ari. You know, the LFA's been going to Brazil.
Yeah.
Couple cards. Those have been absolute bangers. There've been a couple tournaments for those cards too. I want to say he's
Is
been
this
on the
one in Brazil?
card.
No, in
Scroll up.
Minnesota. Okay.
This one's in Minnesota. I
It's in
mean, out of all
Minnesota.
right, Minnesota. But Ari solid. I mean, 12-3 and 11-3. These are records that you would expect to be in the UFC by now. It's just crazy to see the growth of the sport and to see that these fighters are still vying for a spot. Like that to me is insane. And the fact that this isn't even a title fight, that's crazy to me.
Right.
Those records are absolutely insane. Who
In the
who is their bantamweight champion? I'm actually trying to find that now because that's a bantamweight fight. No, yeah,
Yep,
130.
that's bantamweight. Who is their bantamweight champion? I don't.
I know the last champion they had was Dan Argueta, but Dan Argueta is in the UFC. So is that title vacant? And if it's vacant, why is this not a title fight? Must be a number one contender fight if it's the main event.
Double check with the card for 149 last week. I don't know if that was a bantamweight championship fight. I think that was 125. Um, but I see in the co-main event Thomas Peterson. I've seen him before. A guy with some good stand up, I believe. He throws hard. I think he leaves a little bit to be desired in the defeat in the defense. He gets hit a little bit too much, but he's definitely got some talent. They like him and they're pushing him. We'll see what he can do and if he can kind of keep rising up. With a record of 6-1, he's probably just a couple fights away from getting some serious looks at some big name promotions too.
Definitely. I mean, you would have expected Thomas to be a name that you saw in the recent Ultimate Fighter. They had the heavyweights most recently. I was honestly shocked to not see him. I want to say if he didn't lose his most recent fight, he
I
lost a
agree.
but he's solid. He just needed some more tests, right? I mean, on the regional scene, there's a there's this spectrum, right? You're either fighting fans or you're fighting hard people, and I think there's no in between. Thomas was one of those people who was fighting a lot of those older people, maybe people who don't have more like established records like himself. I think he met one of those in his last fight, and obviously, it resulted in a loss, but that doesn't mean that he's not a solid prospect and he isn't on the rise. He's definitely still is, but you need those tests, right, to see where you fall in the division and where you might lie once you get into the one of those big league promotions. So this next fight is big for him. And Mark Richard 6-4. I mean,
I've seen him before. I think he's one of those guys that, um, he hangs around. He's never gonna get out of the fight. He's not a walk in the park. He's gonna give guys a tough out, and he lets some of the better guys get to him. I don't recall seeing too many of his fights, but he's a legit fighter, and he's got some real skills to him. It's just when you face some of the higher level guys, they end up beating you because they're the higher level guys.
well, and they've gone through everything. Like, I think that's the one underestimation that a lot of people like don't take into account when they look at regional fights. Like, sure, this person might have a 6-4 record, but they're experienced, and I'm sure they've fought
Exactly.
the toughest fighters in the world. So even if Thomas is on the other side of the ring as him, and maybe on paper it doesn't seem like it's going to be a scrap, it could very well turn out that way because Richard has probably fought some of the best in the best and doesn't shy away from that. So,
And that's what you see a lot of these times with these records that can be a little deceptive on the regional scene, just because they fought some actual competition and have come out on the wrong side of it. They come out better fighters for it, and the record doesn't always reflect that because sometimes you're getting thrown to the wolves, and you don't necessarily know a guy who's coming in with a 1-0 or a 2-0 record that ends up being the next guy. You know what I mean?
right. No, I totally agree. And I think like heading into the next bout, that 125 co-main event, that Miguel versus Mark. I'm curious to see Mark's like what his opponents look like. 7-1 versus a 4-0 seems like it's a maybe too much of a step up for Miguel, but
Looks like a little bit of an experience deficiency. Yeah, I would say.
right, on paper anyway, right? Who knows? Mark could totally be fighting cans, and Miguel could totally be fighting, you know, winning record opponents. Like that's what's deceiving about looking at these things on paper. And I think when it comes to betting, right, you got to go that extra mile. Take a look at the records of their opponents. So I am curious to see what Mark's opponents look like because a 4-0 versus a 7-1. This could mean one of two things, right? It could mean they're pushing Miguel because they see Mark as a solid opponent for him, or they
Right.
could be pushing Mark and they see that Miguel has had four opponents that don't really like they're
Try to
not
steal the hype from an undefeated opponent.
right, exactly. So it could go either way. Sometimes you see these types of matchups on the regional scene. It's very rare. But 7-1 versus 4-0, that's got it definitely worthy on paper at least of a co-main event on LFA. So um I'm looking forward to that.
And then we got two 6-2 fighters at 170. I've heard of Scott Wirtz before. Not super familiar with Julian Furler, at least initially. A lot of times, what happens is I see them when they're fighting. I'm like, oh, I remember that guy.
Right.
But at least on paper, that seems to be a fair matchup. Both 6-2. Same thing with the next matchup at 185, a 3-0 versus 4-1. Seems to be some decent matchmaking here at the very least. And
And
I
not
think
to say
again, Wes Schultz is another one that I think I've heard of before.
yeah, and not to say that that's rare because I guess depending on the promotion, those types of matchups are rare, but very often do you see people trying to pad their records. So maybe not the most well-known names on this card, but a lot of solid prospects that if you are a fan of the sport and you're not tuning in to see what the next generation is, like you're gonna miss out. This seems to be a very fairly matched card.
And if I'm not mistaken, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves just cruising through the card, but Mitchell McKee, I think I recall him, and at 135, this kid could be a legitimate prospect and early in the making in his career, and I'm curious to see if I'm remembering him correctly, but we'll
He's
definitely be
legit.
tuning in.
He's a mini Michael Chandler. Like when you look at him, he kind of gives you those Michael Chandler vibes where he is eat, sleep, practice, repeat kind of guy. Very seems to have a very solid regimen of training and fight camps. He seems to have it all down packed. He is a collegiate wrestler that has made the transition into MMA. So that alone, you have to respect it because most wrestlers, once you punch them in the face, they're like, "Yeah, I'm out." Right? Like I'm
Oh,
done.
right, back to wrestling.
Exactly. So Mitchell McKee, absolute stud, very, very Michael Chandler esque type of physique and persona. Very fun to watch. Era seems to be a very solid test for him. When I was in my manager bag back in the days, I did have a fighter get matched with him. Mitchell unfortunately declined that opportunity. So it is nice to see him take up a step up in competition, especially while fighting under LFA. So I am excited to watch him. He's a solid prospect, phenomenal wrestling. Let's see how he continues to put that together.
And I don't know if you have anybody else on this card you wanted to talk about before I could move on to Uriah Faber's A1. That's happening the same night, starting an hour later. But um, it looks like a pretty good card for LFA 150. I'll give you a chance for some closing thoughts if you have any.
No closing thoughts. I think it's a solid card, a lot of even matchups. It's going to be interesting to see how it continues to unfold. We'll see which of these fighters will make it into maybe a contender series opportunity later in the year. So, if you're not tuning into UFC Fight Pass or LFA fights at the very least, here is your push to get your ass on it because it's the best cards on the platform and on regional MMA.
Where's that the sound effect? Dun, 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 dun. Jump on it, jump on it.
I don't have one of those, but I definitely need one of the.
You love Mercedes.
Stop it.
So, moving on.
A17, only 7 cards deep into this new promotion. What I remember
Yeah,
correctly,
I think they're just years old.
they used to be called Firepower Promotion, and they evolved into A1. So
Yep.
even though they're new, they do have experience under their belt.
And it's just that they have only had 7 fights with the name of Uriah Faber's A1, right? So they've had 7 with the new name for the promotion, but you're right, they do have some experience in running promotions beforehand. And I'll say I don't want to say a lesser known promotion because they are a little bit lesser known. They run a really good show. They do. They put on entertaining fights. And I don't know if it's something that they have a conversation in the back with the fighters before they come out. They come out and they throw hands. They put on entertaining fights and they scrap from first bell to the end of the fight, whether it's in a finish or in a decision. I mean, I would say there haven't been a whole lot of boring fights in the promotion that I've seen, at least.
No, there's definitely been a lot of solid fights. I think a lot of more so local fights to California. So it's going to be interesting to see how they continue to expand into other states in the United States. But once you put a UFC fighter's name to a promotion, I mean, we're seeing a lot of these on UFC Fight Pass, right? We have James Krause's FAC, we have Anthony Pettis's.
Well, let's see how that progresses. James Krause's FAC.
Right. Regardless of what he's going through nowadays, the promotion seems to be going strong, especially in his side of the world of Kansas. There's not a lot of gyms, right? So it is nice. And Uriah Faber recently took on the A1 promotion, 7 cards ago. I want to say it's maybe a year or a year and a half.
I was going to say a year and a half, maybe 2.
Yeah,
but it's not been a very long time. It's still relatively new, yeah.
Exactly. It's fairly new, but the people behind the scenes are not. So, when you have those experienced people behind the scenes, you do get these solid matchups like Andrew Coyne versus Justin Cornell. It seems to be a solid 145 matchup. I think what you're going to see in A1 are a lot of scrappy fighters, a lot of fighters early on in their careers, and maybe they are champions at 2-0, 3-0, 3-1, right? Like very early on regional champions. But nonetheless, they have the platform now to continue building their hype, building their platforms, building their brands until they eventually get into the main scene. So this seems to be another solid card. I think, like I said, you're going to see a lot of regional fighters, so you might get some matchups like this: Cesar Gonzalez versus Adrian Guzman, 4-5 fighter versus a 6-4. Personally, I love to see that. Right? I'd rather see a 4-5 versus 6-4 than a 5-0 versus 1-2. So
a 6-0 versus a 1-12.
Right. So they're a much more evenly matched fight. Even this Ryan Loader versus Troy Green, that is a phenomenal fight at 185 on the regional scene. Both very early on in their careers, but if you take a look at the landscape of MMA today, you have people being signed to the UFC at 5-0, being signed to Bellator at 1-0, being signed to the PFL at 5-0, right? So a fight like this is a lot of eyes are going to be seeing that because the UFC, let's talk about it, right? They've been forced to sign people early on in their careers because the PFLs and the Bellators are doing so well and recruiting early on. So that's a fight that I'm sure a lot of eyes are on when it comes to the upper echelon of the UFC recruitment division.
Well, and sorry for following a little bit too far down, but I was just looking at, I'm like, three? There's three championship fights on this card, just kind of sprinkled throughout. I mean, I don't know how everybody else feels, but I tend to enjoy the spreading out of the championships. It's kind of nice when you have all three of them at the end of the card, but to have different meaningful and different excitement levels of fights throughout the entire card will definitely create quite a roller coaster. I think it's good booking. That's just my opinion, but I think it is absolutely wild to have three championship fights on the first card of the year, I suppose, for this promotion. But
Yeah,
let me
I
know what
mean
you
it's
think.
huge. It's huge. I mean, I think the winners are going to. It's the perfect time. You want to fight in January, February, March because then you'll have April and May to really get back into recovery and back into a new fight camp. Because what happens in the summer, the Contender Series. So I think this is a solid opportunity for the three title fights. Whoever becomes victorious and emerges victorious from those fights, who knows? Maybe they'll get a Contender Series call up. Maybe they'll get a PFL Challenger Series short notice call up, since that tends to start at the beginning of the year. But nonetheless, a solid card. Um, I know those are the only two regional fights. What's going on in the UFC realm? I know we have our first UFC fight night coming up this upcoming weekend on Saturday. I'm really excited for that. I want to say it's not one of the most exciting cards, but at least on paper to the casual fan. But for us who watch MMA, UFC every single week, there's some fun fights on that. What's going on in the realm of UFC?
And listen, what we say all the time is, wow, on paper, this card didn't really look all that exciting, but this turned out to be one of the best cards of the year because it's all finishes or all this. And this happens all the time where we talk about, wow, on paper, this card did not look great, but it was one of the best cards of the year. So I preface every single card that happens with that.
Yeah,
And they have a great buildup between Dan Ige and Damon Jackson. Scrappy fighters, both of them.
that one's gonna be fun, honestly. And it's a co-main. That is a big co-main event, especially for Jackson, who I feel like hasn't been necessarily fighting some of the top fighters. He's been fighting a lot of those up and comers, those newcomers.
And he's been scratching and clawing his way up. This is his chance to break into the top 15 at 45, a very crowded division.
Very crowded, and I mean, solid opponent, but can you get it done?
We'll
Absolutely.
see. We'll
He's
see.
he's a solid. He's solid. He's big for 145 too, if I remember
Oh,
correctly.
absolutely. He's huge for a 45er. And I think, did Ige move up from 35?
EJ, no, I don't think so because he
No, he's always
fought
been a 45er. Okay.
Alvin Tater. Remember?
Okay. Right. I just wasn't entirely sure. But I mean, Ige, he's fought some of the top names and has hung around. He's on a little bit of a slide if I'm not wrong, but it can only be expected when you're fighting the best of the best of the best.
Exactly. So you got to give him kudos. He's always fighting the best of the best, and doesn't shy away from the people who do want to break into that top 15, right? Like a lot of fighters, they'll say, "Nah, I'm not fighting someone below me in ranking. I want to fight someone above me." So the fact that he continuously takes matchups like this goes a long way, and I think should be appreciated.
He's a fighter, man. He's a fighter.
Definitely.
Um, Keep scrolling down and talk about Puna and Romam Kopylov. I remember that kid, and this is one of those where it's like good booking UFC. You have two really young, up and coming, hot prospects that you're just gonna smash into each other.
Yeah, this is an evenly match. I mean, both 9-2, right? Both big for the future of the 185 division. Puna has gone against some of the best. He only has two losses on his record, but nonetheless, they were hard fought fights. Roman, same thing. So I'm actually very excited. I think this is a big fight.
It's a big exciting fight, but this is one that you would expect to see in a main event in like 2, 3, 5 years from now. And we're seeing it now, so it's a little bit early. We're not quite seeing them, I think, where they could be at their top, but this is going to be a collision. There's no other way to describe it. There will be a collision.
Yeah, no, I agree. And same for the next fight, right? Like Kenlin versus Raquel. That's gonna be a stand-up freaking fight. Like that's gonna be a crazy fight.
Listen, I don't want to hear it from anybody. Raquel Pennington, she can fight. She can fight. And she's come back and she's had quite the resurgence recently. And Vieira has always shown that she's a top competitor in the division. This one, again, listen, if anybody's not excited for this fight, they don't watch fighting. They don't watch MMA. So
I agree. I think Raquel has almost become something like a gatekeeper for the division. And I think when you use that word, sometimes it has a negative connotation, but it should be seen as a positive, right? A gatekeeper to any division and any, industry. It doesn't matter if it's fighting or not. A gatekeeper is really pivotal to the division because that means that they are still very solid despite their experience and maybe their age. They're still solid. They're still putting on quality fights. And guess what? If you can't beat them, you ain't top 10 worthy. That's just it. You ain't top 3 worthy. Like Ketlin's already ranked number 3. She's had fights that were very scrappy against some solid competition. But if you beat Raquel, especially in a decisive fashion, that goes a long ways for your career. So I'm excited
to see. That's still a stamp of approval.
100%. You have to appreciate your legends, your gatekeepers, people who have done this before you, because it's almost like a passing of the torch. If you can beat them, you're on the right path. If you can't, you got to step it up a little bit in training. So, yeah, I'm excited for that fight. Even the next 135 fight, right? Umar versus Raoni. That is a scrap. That is a scrap for sure.
And we all know Nurmagomedov, right?
Oh, 100%. I mean, he's solid, right? He's solid, but he's not fighting a can, to say the least. He's fighting somebody who is very solid. Maybe a little older for the division, but I mean, 17-3. That's nothing.
And it's going to be a real test. And obviously, I mean, maybe the name Nurmagomedov rings a bell for more people because they know Khabib, and there's the news about him retiring from coaching this week that was coming out, and we'll see how that goes. I'm sure he's still in the corner or has helped him at least this week, leading up to this fight. But this is still another fight that should show out, and I shouldn't be anyone running over the other. It should be a really well-matched fight between two high-level fighters that do Nurmagomedov, the grappling and wrestling, and Raoni. I'm sure the jiu-jitsu is going to be right there just as well. So this should be another great matchup, and we'll see how it plays out between the two.
I think it's definitely the best way to open up this card, especially. I mean, even though Umar's 15-0 and Raoni's 17-3. They are still relatively unknown to the masses, to the casuals. So this is a solid place for them to scrap and see who comes up triumphant. So definitely excited for that fight. It looks like there's a couple prelim fights, some people that maybe people aren't familiar with, but I know for me personally, Nick Fiore 6-0. He's fighting Mateus, who is far more experience. I'm kind of upset at the matchup, to say
only by 11 fights.
Right. Like it sucks to see this type of mismatch happen, but who the hell knows? This is mixed martial arts, right? It's one of the most exciting sports in the world. You don't know what the hell can happen. And when it comes to New England fighters, you know me, it's a wrap. I don't care who they're going up against. I'm riding for Nick until the death. So
right.
I'm excited.
And I mean, I remember Javid from Contender Series. he,
That's a
he
fun
was
fight.
one of my favorite guys because the guy that was he was fighting was talking shit to him and said
Racist shit. Yeah,
some racist shit, and he made him pay for 3 rounds and then said, okay, there's like 30 seconds left in the fight, now I'll choke you out and submit you, and finished him then. I mean, that was an all-time moment. It was talk shit, say racist shit, I'm gonna beat the snot out of you, and when I want to finish you, I'm going to.
yeah, literally. And it's sad that he's getting a really tough opponent for his first fight. And I only say that because there's some fighters who come into the UFC and fight far less experienced fighters, much easier fighters for them.
And
Um,
two undefeated fighters, the somebody's always got to go. But I mean, it's the case here. Two undefeated fighters coming in, and someone's going to come out with a loss, unfortunately. But it only builds your stardom moving forward for either one of the fighters, whoever comes out with the win.
Agreed. I think it's one of those fights that fight fans can't go wrong with. Enjoy it, sit back, shut up, and keep it moving. So yeah, that's a fun fight. Even the next fight, I mean, Allen versus Carlos seems like a mismatch in terms of their records, but both are very fun fighters to watch. I think same with the next two, right? Dan and Isaac. In
And
one
we talked
versus
about Dan. We talked about
yeah,
Dan a little bit before, right?
the most
Um,
interesting Dan in the world. We love Dan.
yeah, he's great. Shaved his head to make weight to win a championship. I mean, all the more power to him. At 45, is he usually a 45er?
No. Well, remember he fought on the Ultimate Fighter 29 in the bantamweight division, so he
Right,
has
right.
been taking these last few
So
fights at
move
145, and last one he didn't win against Damon, who's in the co-main event. So the
right.
fact that he's still fighting at 145, I think, just goes to show that he's young and he's growing into his body. But nonetheless, you have to take that into account, right? When you're going up against an actual featherweight like Isaac.
Yeah, and again, 5-0. Isaac coming in undefeated, and another early prospect. And you love to have these guys fight each other early on to kind of build their names and raise their stardom. And this the same exact thing between Jimmy Flick and Charles Johnson. That's going to be a wild fight. Flick is going to be chasing him around, trying to grapple Johnson. He's going to run, and with it'll be his track background that they're going to talk about at some point, I'm sure, for Charles Johnson. But those are two incredible fighters too, both coming up from LFA. I think both former champions as well,
Yep.
right?
Yeah, 100%. And honestly, like, I don't know about you, but the fact that Jimmy Flick is back, the brick of Jimmy Flick, I'm excited. I mean, this kid was fun. He's a submission magician.
Mhm.
He's a wizard on the ground. I when he retired, I thought it was too soon. I understood why he retired, but I'm so glad he's back. And to see him back in the UFC taking on solid competition, you just gotta respect it. Who knows if he's been training, regardless of it, whether or not he retired. But nonetheless, he was a
Hopefully, he comes back with resurgence and a new energy, and
hunger.
whatever he was missing, hopefully he found it, and whatever he needs to take care of. We're happy to see him back in MMA. That's the point that I'm trying to get to,
Yeah,
basically.
definitely glad to see him back where he belongs. Hoping for the best. Solid matchup, tough matchup, but look at his record, look at his resume. He's never shied away from a tough fight. So glad to see him back. And the fight to kick us off the card. I mean, Priscilla versus Sajara. That is a fun fight. Both of them have been in solid fights. I don't know if you remember when we were drunk in Las Vegas, we saw Sajara at a
Yeah, yeah.
took a picture with Sajara.
Was
That was
she in an all pink suit or something?
all super fun.
Right,
That was before all the fiasco and the news started breaking about her and her relationships. But nonetheless, she's back.
right.
She's fighting at 135 against Priscilla, who, is another one of those fighters who is a little bit scrappy. She finds the way to win sometimes. 12-4. That's a solid record for the women's division. So this should be a fun fight to open up the card.